So we'll go ahead and get started. The speaker for today is Dr. Ken Mossman from
Arizona State.
No, I know. Arizona. I thought somebody was coming there. Arizona State University. He's a professor of health physics and the director of the radiation safety office there. Dr. Mossman is originally from Canada, Windsor, Ontario. He has a BS in biology from Wayne State University in Detroit and MS and PhD degrees in radiation biology from this institution. He is previously from 1973 to 1990, he was a faculty member at Georgetown University, and since 1990 he's been at Arizona State. He's also a past president of the Health Physics Society. And Ken's going to talk to us today about radiation protection and the precautionary principles. Okay? People are probably wondering or something on their way.
Thank you, Larry, for the fine introduction, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come back to UT and see some old friends and visit the campus once again. My wife and I are here for the first time since we actually graduated, which is back in the early 70s. So it's lots of things have changed, and we're looking forward to walking around campus and going to the football game tomorrow. And,
tell them where your seat is, Ken.
Well, Blair, my wife, Blair and I are sitting in the president's box. No Eli Fly, and an invitation was cordially extended, so we couldn't say no. So I said, well, so we're here, and we're looking forward to tomorrow, which should be an exciting time. As mentioned, I want to talk today about radiation protection and the precautionary principle. And for those of you that are not familiar with the precautionary principle, it was a concept that was born, if you will, in Europe, has taken hold quite significantly in the European environmental community, is also important in the United States, but has not received the level of attention or the legal standing in the United States that it has in many European countries. And the precautionary principle, as you can see here, it has often been rephrased as better safe than sorry. I think that's probably the common phrase that's been linked to the precautionary principle more than any other. But basically, we take actions to avoid potentially damaging impacts of toxic agents, and of course I'm going to focus on ionizing radiation. We think of toxic agents as chemicals more usually when we talk about the precautionary principle, but it certainly is not restricted to that. So I'm going to focus on ionizing radiation as the toxic agent when scientific evidence of a causal effect is limited or lacking altogether. So even though we may not fully understand or fully appreciate the magnitude of the environmental or health effects of exposure to the toxin, we nonetheless, under the precautionary principle, will want to take steps to minimize exposure. And of course, the concern is that costs money, and it could be substantial sums of money involved in reducing exposure to the toxin. And the ultimate question is, does the decrease in dose or exposure translate to a concomitant decrease in public health risk or environmental impact? That's the linkage. And obviously, when allocating large resources to trying to reduce dose, you hope that you are having some effect on the public health or the environment. Frankly, there are very few agents that we know about in terms of human health impact for which there is a clear reduction in public health detriment when you reduce dose. The most well-known is clearly cigarette smoking. If we reduce the number of cigarettes consumed, we have a concomitant reduction in lung cancer. Now, it's not a reduction which occurs right away. There's about a 20-year lag because of the carcinogenesis process, but we know that that's absolutely clear. For a few other agents, we know that it's also true, that if you reduce the dose, you do have a concomitant reduction in risk. But for certain agents, like ionizing radiation in very, very small doses, it remains questionable about whether reduction in dose actually turns out to be beneficial to the public health. So we take action to prevent harms from occurring in the first place, which is a good thing to do. Prevention is always preferable to having to deal with some type of environmental or public health detriment. If we could avoid harms, then we should try to do that. Please feel free to stop me if you have a question or you would like to clarify a particular issue. The precautionary principle in radiation protection is implicit in protection, but it is not explicit. For example, ICRP 60, ICRP, the International Commission on Radiological Protection, in its report number 60, states, quote, "It must be presumed that even small radiation doses may produce some deleterious health effects." So even very small doses may be harmful, and therefore we should reduce dose where we can in order to reduce the risk. There may well be risks at low doses that aren't detectable by epidemiology. Again, the old saying, the absence of data does not necessarily mean the absence of risk. When effects are not detected, it is unknown whether or not they exist. So this is the uncertainty aspect of the precautionary principle that's surfaced here, in that we're really not sure what's going on, and therefore, in the absence of direct information, we should proceed cautiously. And what my arguments will be to you today, in fact, for ionizing radiation, we do know what's going on at small doses. It's not a question, as we have with many environmental chemicals, environmental toxins. For ionizing radiation, it's well known what's going on in small doses. We have in excess of 50 years of human epidemiological experience that transcends a wide range of exposures, for which we have substantial information at what's happening at environmental and occupational levels. So in radiation protection, we assume, as we would apply the precautionary principle, we assume that there's little or no scientific information available at environmental and occupational doses, and as I just said. In fact, that's not a valid assumption. In the case of radiological health effects, we have lots of information. We assume that there's no safe dose, and this is a product of the well-known linear no threshold theory, which is a fundamental foundation of health physics, a foundation of radiation protection, in which we assume that if we have the radiation dose, we have the radiological risk, and any dose, no matter how small, is potentially harmful. We also assume that the absence of risk evidence is not evidence of absence of risk. The precautionary principle does ask the right question. I don't think anyone argues that the notion of how we can prevent harms to health and to the environment before it occurs is a good thing, but it provides the wrong answers. It's an unworkable guide to decision making, and I'll discuss what I mean by this momentarily. It's essentially ineffective because it fails to distinguish between what we mean by risks and what we mean by hazards. And it ignores the very serious problem of excessive precautions itself being risky. Asking a radiation worker, for instance, to open a 55-gallon drum containing radioactive waste to be sure that the inventory, the information available on what's in the waste drum is accurate, is a risky procedure for which there is little benefit gained by it, and you're exposing the the worker to unnecessary occupational hazard. For instance, let me provide you with examples of what I mean by some of these ambiguities. For instance, the precautionary principle does not address questions like, what early indications of potential hazards are needed to trigger precautions? How substantial must the potential risk be? Is there any threshold that we need to worry about? Or is any risk, however it's defined, sufficient to trigger precaution? What level of risk is acceptable? In other words, is there a safe dose? I'm defining the term safe as being an acceptable level of risk, not zero risk, because every activity that humans engage in involves some risk. We consider certain activities as being safe when we say that the risk that we engage in is acceptable. You fly from Knoxville to Nashville or something like that, there's a risk involved in taking the airplane. But most people would agree that it is a very small risk and that it is acceptable, and therefore the activity is considered to be safe. How much data must be presented to demonstrate safe? I mean, we know quite a bit about radiation. All of the epidemiological studies involving humans would suggest that below a dose of about 200 milligray or 200 millisievert, which translates to 20 rad, there's little scientific evidence to support the notion that there is significant radiological risk in adult populations. If you look at children, there's some data which suggests that the dose is a little bit smaller when you look at thyroid cancer, but that's in children under specified conditions. But basically, there is a dose cutoff, if you will, of about 200 milligray, where we say that above that dose, there's a clear risk to health. Below that dose, there's not such a clear indication of risk. That doesn't mean that the risk isn't present. What I'm saying is that it is either absent or it's so small we can't measure it. And that's a function of the epidemiology. I mean, how we measure risk in human populations. Epidemiology is a very crude observational science. And there are many problems in terms of interpretation of epidemiological evidence, confounding variables, etc., that make it very difficult to be able to discern a radiological risk at very, very small doses, particularly when you consider that the natural background cancer mortality rate is very high in humans. It's about 20%. So we're looking, in the absence of radiation, at a very high noise background. You engineers know about noise, signal-to-noise ratio. We're talking about a huge noise factor here of about 20%, and at very, very small doses that we typically encounter in environmental and in occupational settings, the risk which is added to that background is so small that you can't discern it very well. In other words, the signal is very small. So I'm not arguing, I'm not saying that the risk is zero. I'm saying that it could be zero, but it also could be so small that we can't measure it with the epidemiological techniques that are currently available to us. Now, epidemiology is improving. There are molecular techniques which are emerging that will help us understand better what's going on at these very small doses, but currently the situation is that there doesn't seem to be any enhanced risk at these very small doses. So how much data do we need to come up with to demonstrate safe? I would think that we have sufficient data now in the ionizing radiation arena. With chemicals and various kinds of environmental agents, we don't. There's no doubt about it. But in terms of ionizing radiation, there certainly is some significant information that we do have available. Cost considerations is probably a key issue that one of the major issues that are not fully wrapped into the dialogue on precautionary principle, the cost of cleanup, the cost of reducing environmental exposure, public health exposure. What's that involved? Are we talking billions of dollars, trillions of dollars? What do we get when we spend that kind of money? Do we get a concomitant reduction, as I said before, in public health benefit or environmental protection? Risk trade-offs. If we engage in some particular activity to reduce dose of the toxin that's of interest, are there other risks which are elevated as a consequence of engaging in that activity? Again, this notion of characterizing radioactive waste. If you have to go into a barrel, reopen a barrel to determine what kind of waste that you have in there for whatever reason to meet a particular regulatory standard or particular policy, by doing that, are you enhancing the risks to workers by doing that recharacterization? What type of precautionary action is required under certain circumstances? Again, an issue that is unclear in terms of how you implement the principle. And then what is the role of risk assessment in the application of the precautionary principle? If you think of the precautionary principle in a way as a management tool, then how does that impact or how does that inform the risk assessment process in which we try to characterize the toxin, develop dose-response relationships, and understand what the levels of risks are at various radiation doses? So implementation, the ambiguities that I talked about, invites arbitrariness. We have a situation in which, because the precautionary principle is not clearly formatted, in which we understand how it should be implemented under certain circumstances, the lack of that kind of structure invites arbitrary and sometimes capricious use of the precautionary principle. There's no standard formulation of the precautionary principle. There's no agreement about what the role of the precautionary principle ought to be in environmental protection, public health protection. And there are, as a consequence, no set of criteria which would assist in guiding implementation of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle, as I said, requires us to take action with little or no scientific evidence. It assumes, in many respects, a linear dose-response relationship with no threshold. In other words, we assume no safe dose. The primary goal of the precautionary principle is minimization of risks. The secondary goal, if it's a goal at all, is the cost of risk reduction. In radiation protection, we do use the linear no threshold theory as a basis for radiation protection practice. There is, however, some uncertainty about the appropriateness of the LNT theory in radiological health. There are other theories which may actually be more representative of the real world in terms of explaining the relationship between radiological dose and health impacts. But nonetheless, the LNT theory continues to be the favored theory among standard-setting organizations, learned groups such as the National Academy of Sciences and the NCRP and the ICRP. And the LNT is used primarily because it is a reasonable middle ground. The alternative theories to the LNT are bounds or are extremes to the LNT predictions. One can use a threshold or hormesis theory, which would predict a reduced risk at small dose compared to the LNT, or one could use a superlinearity theory and certain others that would suggest that the risk is even higher than what the LNT would predict at small dose. But the LNT is viewed as a reasonable middle ground, and until these learned groups and standard-setting organizations are convinced that the data are clearly not supportive of the LNT theory will continue to be the coin of the realm, if you will. In radiation protection, we use the as low as reasonably achievable philosophy as a way of reducing dose. And if you will, this is sort of at the other end of the precautionary principle spectrum. And what we say in the ALERA philosophy is that we try to reduce radiation dose as much as we can, but what bounds it is the social and economic costs. So in determining dose targets that we would want to implement in an ALERA program, we need to ask ourselves the question, well, number one, what's it going to cost us to reduce the dose down to a particular target level, and then what's the benefit of doing that? So ALERA is very much based on a balance of risks and benefits. Safe dose is an issue which continues to plague radiation protection and nuclear technologies. I am now, from a professional standpoint, pushing very hard the notion that we should be able to stand up. We, nuclear engineers, nuclear scientists, should stand up, and we ought to be able to declare a particular dose level, whatever that might be, as safe. You know, we don't do that. I mean, look, for instance, at the Environmental Protection Agency's Federal Guidance Report 13.1, which lists cancer mortality risk coefficients for a whole variety of radionuclides, tritium all the way up to uranium and plutonium. They list them in terms of becquerel. So the risk coefficients are 10 to the minus 11, 10 to the minus 12, 10 to the minus 13 per becquerel. You know, anti-nuclear groups, members of the general public look at these federal guidance figures, and what do they conclude? Naturally, the only thing they conclude is any dose is harmful. If we're down to becquerels and we're talking about 10 to the minus 13 as a risk coefficient, I mean, when you think about it, 10 to the minus 13 is such a small risk that the population of the world is not large enough for us to detect a single cancer. I mean, it's a theoretical number which is beyond the realm of belief or of understanding. So what I'm saying is that the EPA is an example of one federal agency which has taken the linear theory to an extreme. And they believe that no dose of radiation is safe. Well, the general public believes that too. And I think it's time that health professionals, radiological health professionals, nuclear engineers, radiologists, other clinicians stand up and say, whatever the number is, 5 millisievert a year, whatever ultimately is decided, we can say that unintentional exposure is at 5 millisievert a year, as an example, is safe. It's not going to cause a person exposed to that dose any harm. So we need to get into that kind of mode where we get away from what the linear no threshold theory is often, unfortunately, interpreted to mean. And when I'm talking about safe dose, I'm basing it on strong scientific evidence. It's not a fly-by-night declaration. It's not anything that's based on shaky scientific information. It's a very, very, it would be a declaration that's based on clear scientific data. And as I mentioned, scientific, at these very, very small doses, we're talking about very, very small risks in which we can't detect them. And here's an example of what I mean by that. These are power curves, and power is a statistical concept that essentially says what's the probability of detecting a risk if it's really there. And so a power of 100% in an epidemiological study would say that I detect the risk every time it's present. And if the power is 0%, then I say that I'm not detecting the risk at all if it's present. And 50% would mean half the time I'm detecting the risk. And you can see that the power curves are very much dependent upon the size of the population. And here are power calculations that I did for various radiological risks. And down here, well, let me just point out this information on the bullets. That's more meaningful. At 100 millisievert, which turns out to be a risk of 0.005 down here, the power is 90%. That means 90% of the time we detect a risk. If the population is 100,000, and it's 100% if it's 1 million or more. At 10 millisievert, which is a dose that's more in line with occupational exposure situations, the risk is 0.0005. The power is only 6% for a population of 100,000. It's 17% for a population of 1 million, and it's 90% for a population of 10 million. If you remember, the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, that was a population of about 80,000. That's the largest single study that we have of human exposures at over a wide range of doses. So even there, it's only because the radiation dose, average dose to survivors of the atomic bombings was about 200 millisievert that we were able to see risk. In fact, if you look at the mortality spectrum in the Japanese survivors, 99% of all of the cancer mortality occurs in individuals who were exposed to 50 rad and more. At the lower doses, you don't see any. I saw a hand. Yes?
I was wondering what the units were on the radiogenic risk.
That's just risk. There's no units. That's just total lifetime risk. No, it's just for instance, over here. What I'm saying is that the risk from radiogenic risk is 10%, and here it's a risk of 1%. It's a fraction. The lifetime cancer mortality risk in a human population without regard to radiation exposure is 20%. So, in other words, 1 in 5 of us in this room will die during our lifetimes of cancer. You know, some, unfortunately, will die within the next 5 years. Others will live a long, long time before they die. But if you look collectively at the total risk in this room of this population, statistically, it ought to be about 1 in 5. Okay? That's the mortality. The incidence is a bit higher. The incidence is more like about 1 in 3, because obviously more people will have the disease than die from it unless everybody dies from it. And it turns out that about 50% of cancer patients live beyond a 5-year or 10-year interval of observation, which would mean that they're essentially cured. Did I answer your question? So we're looking at, as the risk of radiogenic cancer, in other words, cancer caused by radiation, increases, then the power to detect the risk also increases, and we see that larger populations are able to detect lower risks simply because of the larger numbers. So the point here is that at very, very small doses, where we typically are concerned environmentally and occupationally, the power is very small, even when you go to very large populations. So the likelihood that epidemiological studies are going to see anything is exceedingly small. And that's why there is a big push in the federal government, the Department of Energy, and in fact there are several faculty members here that are involved in the Department of Energy low dose program. One of the initiatives there is to understand from a molecular and cellular approach what it is that's happening, so that we can supplement the epidemiological information with some hard biology that will help us understand what the magnitude of the risk is. What's the shape of the dose response curve? Do we in fact have a threshold? The epidemiology can't tell you whether you have a threshold or not. It just isn't good enough at the very small doses. But cellular biology studies, molecular studies, microdosimetric studies may be able to help us better understand whether, in fact, a threshold exists or not. I've been interested in this notion of safe dose for some time, and I took the initiative of surveying the Health Physics Society population, or membership, excuse me. There's about 6,000 members in the Health Physics Society. Many of the people in this room are members, and I sent out a survey on safe dose via the HPS newsletter. So this went out to the 6,000 members. I only got 105 responses after about a 2-month response period. I'm not sure what that means. If I put my pessimistic hat on, I conclude that it's apathy. People just don't care. And that may be true. The others may have been interested in the problem, but they didn't bother looking on page 29, which was sort of buried in the middle of the newsletter, and they perhaps missed it. But nonetheless, about 2% of the society membership did respond to my survey. I asked several questions regarding employment sector and health physics specialty to characterize the response population to determine whether I was looking at a bias group or a group that was reflective of the entire population. And in fact, when I looked at health physics specialty, whether they were interested in accelerators or medical health physics or whatever, and their employment sector, whether they were in universities or government or private companies or whatever, it turned out that the respondents reflected the entire society. So I was quite comfortable with the notion that the responses that I've got were pretty much what I would get from the whole society if everybody decided to respond to the survey. 80% of the respondents favored the society issuing a position statement, which is very interesting. What I simply asked is, do we have enough information about effects of radiation at small doses that you think the Health Physics Society should issue a position statement about safe dose of radiation, without indicating what the safe dose might be, but just conceptually the notion of having a position statement on safe dose, and 80% of the individuals responded favorably. 90% agree that we know enough about low dose health effects to declare some level of radiation as safe. And then when I asked individuals to indicate what they would think is a safe dose of radiation for incidental radiation exposures, in other words, radiations that might be coming out of a nuclear power plant during normal operations, exposures which were unintended. The median dose is about 5.5 millisieverts per year, which is about 5 times the annual natural background radiation level, excluding the contribution of radon and its progeny. If you include radon and its progeny, then we're talking about a safe dose which is roughly 1.5 to 2 times. This also happens to be very close to the old public exposure limit from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The U.S. NRC reduced its public exposure limit to 1 millisievert per year. I must be 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. It used to be 5 millisievert a year. The public exposure limit used to be an order of magnitude lower than the occupational limit. So this is pretty much in line with that old public exposure limit. Now, what I've done was drafted a position statement for consideration by the Scientific and Public Issues Committee on the question of safe dose, using this 5.5 millisievert as a starting point. I don't know ultimately where it may end up. The society may decide not to issue a statement. It may decide to issue a statement that's significantly modified from what it is that I've offered, but it's now on the society's, it's in the society's court and we'll see what it is that happens. But I think it's very important that organizations like the Health Physics Society, American Nuclear Society, various clinical societies involved in radiological practice stand up and say, you know, there is a dose of radiation that, you know, I would feel comfortable my kids getting unintentionally, that I'm not concerned would be pose any particular harm. That's not, of course, to say that we should abandon Alera. On the contrary, we should always maintain a protection philosophy that includes Alera as low as reasonably achievable. But in the event of unintentional radiation exposures, if someone gets a dose below a particular safe level, whatever that is, we ought to be able to stand up collectively as experts and say, yes, this is a safe dose and there is no concern for public harm. There's nothing scientifically or epidemiologically available that would suggest that it is harmful. Now let me get to the meat of my talk, which won't take long, but I do want to get to this. My thesis is that the precautionary principle is inappropriate in radiation protection. I'm not arguing that the precautionary principle is not useful in other controls of toxins in the environment or in public health. But when it comes to radiation protection, I think it's clear that radiation protection is not something which is amenable to the precautionary principle. The European Commission communication on the precautionary principle was published in the year 2000 and is a very important document because this document is very clear on identifying when and how we ought to be using the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is appropriate when data are limited and there is significant scientific uncertainty. That's essentially the key element in terms of identifying when the precautionary principle is appropriate. Of course, with radiation, there is extensive radiological health data available. So the question about limited data is not applicable in this particular case. The precautionary principle should be provisional until sufficient data are available. And of course, with radiological protection, it's unlikely that we're going to find any new data in the short term that would fundamentally change what we already know. We continue to evaluate the Japanese survivors of the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the data, which is primarily now coming from individuals who were children at the time of the bombings, is very important to help us further refine radiological risk estimates. But basically, the risk estimates that we now have, which are known within about a factor of 2, probably as well as we know anything with regard to human carcinogens, we're probably not going to get much better than the accuracy that we currently have. So I conclude from this that the precautionary principle should not be used in radiation protection because, one, there is substantial information available on radiological risks already. We already know how to handle risks in terms of sophisticated management procedures. We understand what the magnitude of these risks are, and it's time that we stand up as a Health Physics Society and other organizations to issue a position statement, a directive, whatever it is that you want to call it, indicating that there is a safe dose of radiation, if in fact people are willing to buy into that. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions. Question?
I guess I would agree with what you said in regard to there is such dose, I don't know what it is. But would you then advocate also not using the LNT for regulatory purposes?
Yeah, it's that's correct.
You'd have to, wouldn't you?
Well, you don't have to, but
I'm logically consistent. If you're going to say there is a safe dose, then you would have to say then the LNT should not be used for regulatory purposes. Well,
but the way I define safe dose is that the risk is acceptable. So I'm not saying that the risk is zero. If I said that at a safe dose the risk is zero, then you're right. The linear no threshold theory then is no longer operable. But what I'm saying is that I'm saying the activity is safe if you do not exceed an acceptable level of risk. It's the old below regulatory concern policy from the NRC, where they said, essentially from a legal standpoint, below a particular dose, we don't need to regulate this because the risk is so small that it's not worth dealing with.
Right, but when they tried to do that, everybody got finished.
Oh yeah, no, there's no question the BRC problem was mishandled from a public relations standpoint. I think it's very well. I think it deserves revisiting, keeping in mind just what you said, that it took a lot of bashing and it needs to be reformulated. But I don't believe that what I said in any way negates the linear no threshold theory. If you agree with me that when we talk about safe, what we're meaning is an acceptable level of risk, not zero risk. Now, having said that, I'm not in support of the linear theory at small doses to predict quantitatively risk. I think there is such uncertainty at small doses where we don't fully understand what the magnitude of risk is, say at occupational or environmental levels.
But if you don't redraw it, then the lawyers are going to continue to use it. If you don't get a consensus for redrawing it, that it is zero. If you say that it's no never mind, then you have to set it to zero. Well, in which case, then it can't be used for regulatory or risk assessment.
You're correct again. And my retort to that is, I think that we need to relook at the whole regulatory structure and change things back to a dose-based system of protection, where we get rid of the notion of risk. What do we measure when we in radiation protection? We don't measure risk. We measure dose. You wear a foam badge, or you have some other kind of sophisticated measurement system. That's what you're measuring. Why not anchor that to the background radiation level? And I'll admit that there are problems with that, but in concept, it's a worthwhile thing to look at, in which we say that, you know, a background radiation level excluding radon and its progeny, 1 millisievert a year. Why not, as Roger Clark is doing at the ICRP, rethinking the ICRP system, and right now he has very few people in his camp, but he's rethinking the ICRP system in which it's anchored against the natural background and essentially not against risk. If you avoid having to deal with the risk question, then you avoid having to deal with LNT.
You know, a lot of consulting firms out of business.
Yeah, I realize they take money out of people's pockets. Peter.
I just wanted to make a comment. I think it would be much easier for learned societies and other organizations to take a stand if there would be a paper in the literature that would reanalyze the ABOM survivor data, for instance, and say, here's a threshold model and here's a linear model. This has not happened up to this point. And the reason why it hasn't happened is that to get the data, you have to go to Japan. What they give you, if you look at their website, is not sufficient.
Right. Agreed.
So the first step that would be, seems to me necessary, is there would have to be political pressure for them to open up the data.
Right. No, I don't disagree. In fact, in a paper I recently wrote on hormesis, I call essentially for that, exactly what you're saying, that the RERF should be required to provide unreduced data. You know, we need to see the raw data, not what it is that they publish. You're absolutely correct, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to determine in a systematic fashion whether or not there are thresholds that exist or not. The REF, as you know, is wedded to the notion of the linear theory, and all of their data reduction methodologies is inherently based on that. Well, already you've got a bias.
I agree.
You know, I mean, I think you're right on.
I love your book. The only thing I don't believe is when you say that the precautionary principle could be useful anywhere else. Precautionary principle, the way it has been articulated by EU, is just a way for the politics to take the decision out of the hand of science. And this applies in your field. This applies in all the fields I know, including pollution, including food safety, including the GMO business, the hormone in the beef, all of that. It is the way for the regulatory agencies and the politicians in Europe to survive.
No, I do not disagree with you. I was just trying to be cautious about restricting my comments really to the radiological situation because that's what I know about.
I give you just one example. A few years, there is a whole movement of people here and in Europe under the precautionary principle to ban chlorine compounds in the water. About 10 years ago, Peru was short of money, and they decided, based on that, to stop chlorination of the drinking water. That started a 5-year epidemic of cholera. 1.3 million people lived it, 11,000 died. That is absolutely no common measure with the number of people who could have risked to get the cancer because of chlorine in the water. It's much, much higher. So, and this is again an application, but the precautionary principle essentially tells we politicians know better than you what is dangerous and what is not, and we make a decision based on the data, but essentially based on the hysteria level of the population.
Well, the politicians are making decisions not only on the science, but also on other non-scientific issues which are important. I mean, there are economic questions, there are constituency questions, and these are also factored in. Now, that's not to say that the science isn't important. It is, but it's not the only driver in policymaking. In fact, science frequently is a minor driver in policymaking. And I think, I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I agree with everything that you've said, but you know, it's.
This is at the root of a number of fights that you have seen in the paper, and which are just in the framework of a real trade war.
Yes.
Europe and US.
Costs money, right? I agree.
Dan, James?
You mentioned the survey
Yes.
had a safe dose of 5.5
That's the median.
median.
Right.
What do you personally feel, given your experience, was a reasonable number for safe dose?
Well, I didn't include, I took the survey myself before I actually had it published, you know, just to see how long it would take and, you know, how I would respond. And as it turned out, I picked 5 millisievert per year as a median dose. I mean, I was comfortable with that. And as it turned out, that was the median dose. Now, there were some people who said it ought to be 50 millisievert a year. In other words, the occupational exposure limit. And to a certain extent, those people are absolutely right, because there is no evidence that individuals who have been exposed to any dose below occupational exposure limits have been harmed by radiation. I think that's a little bit too much. You know, I mean, I think that there needs to be some reason in this. But I think 5 millisievert per year is a reasonable number. It was a number that I thought was reasonable. As it turns out, it was the median value. There are other people who thought, you know, 1/10 of a millisievert.
Kenneth talks about the possible positive effects of low-level radiation on health.
You're talking about radiation hormesis. Yeah, there's lots of evidence in cells, in tissue culture, in plant systems, in animal systems, where small doses of radiation have been shown to be beneficial. And what we mean by that is the background rate of cancer or whatever health effect you're looking at is actually reduced as a result of the dose at these very small levels. So there's some kind of stimulation, there's some kind of beneficial effect which is associated with the small dose. The problem is there's very little evidence for this in human populations exposed to small doses. Perhaps the most important population, again, the population at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and going back to Professor Grower's point, where we need to reanalyze all of the scientific data, the Japanese survivors over the entire dose range. What you actually find now in the open literature is that every single biologically plausible theory which you can ascribe to describe the relationship between dose and health effects in humans has been applied successfully to the Japanese data, including hormesis, linear theory, superlinearity, quadratic linear. Everything you can possibly say. Now, there are hormesis proponents who have looked at the Japanese data and say, here it is, but it's not so simple because there is some uncertainty. I have trouble with hormesis simply because, well, it's more than simple, but the major problem I have is that it's unclear what the biological mechanisms are. I mean, if we're going to talk about causality, in other words, a small dose of radiation results in some beneficial effect to the organism, then in properly understanding that causal relationship, you need to understand an operative biological mechanism. And it's unclear what that would be with hormesis. Now, admittedly, in cell culture systems, they have found that there are enhanced repair mechanisms which are going on in the cell. That's all true, but that kind of phenomenon becomes very difficult to translate when you're going to the whole organism. So hormesis is a phenomenon which is getting increasing attention. It's an important phenomenon that has been demonstrated in a number of systems, particularly chemicals. The most well-known hormesis example is selenium. Small doses of selenium are required in vitamin E biosynthesis, but at high doses is absolutely toxic. So there's no question that there is hormesis. But where it sits with radiation, it's unclear. And the data are such at small doses that it's not a clearly defined phenomenon. I direct you to a paper I wrote in Health Physics in March of this year on that issue. Clearly lays out my position, which I've pretty much expressed here. I hope that answers your question.
Other questions?
Isn't that parasexual?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that parasexual? The poison is a dose?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Paracelsus, absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely correct. I mean, you can make the argument water is hormetic. At small doses, you need water. At large doses, you can drown. I mean, it gets to be ridiculous. Sure, the dose makes the poison.
I agree that as the dose goes down toward the background radiation level, that the risk obviously goes down, and the cost in preventing that those doses will substantially rise. But has there been very much research in humans for nearly zero radiation? That might do.
Well, there have been studies of populations that live in high natural background radiation areas. And there are a few of these around the world. Kerala, India, the monazite sand areas of Brazil, a couple of places in Iran, even in the United States. Denver, Colorado, Santa Fe, New Mexico have average natural background radiation levels roughly twice what they are in this area. Middle Atlantic region, and none of those studies have indicated a detrimental health effect from the enhanced radiation exposure to the populations living in those areas. Now that I've said that, let me say that such conclusions are tempered by the power characteristic of the studies that I alluded to before. We're talking about such small increments in dose and small populations exposed, that the power is very, very small. It may be a few percent at most, which means that it is more likely than not that the risk will be detected if it's present. So that's the fundamental problem. And there have been a variety of studies looking at these natural background radiation levels, but when you look at them collectively, and given all of the limitations of the epidemiology, there is no support for the notion that these populations are at higher risk for any kinds of cancers. And of course, you need to correct for cigarette smoking and alcohol consumption, migratory patterns, all that kind of stuff.
Other questions? All right, well, let's thank the speaker again. Maybe we're hanging around for a while to answer any financial questions that you have. But if not, then we're finished.
Try not to move. No, you told me don't move because I got the cigarette.
One of the things that I've recently, I haven't seen